Hello and welcome to the Fen Den. I'm your host, Sean Allen Fenn, and my goal is to win your hearts and to change your minds. Have you ever wondered what makes art so expensive when you walk into a gallery and you see a strange artwork that looks like your 4-year-old child did it and it's marked at $20,000? How is that possible, and why is that happening, and who actually buys this stuff? Have you ever thought about that? Well, that's a great question, and that's what this episode of the Fen Den is about. Today, I'm your host, Sean Allen Fenn, and I am here to illuminate your path into the future. And in order to do that, I think it would be great for your life if you bought more art. Why? Because having it is an evolutionary signifier of wealth and surplus, and in the same way that music, if you think about it, it's been said that music is useless. And if you were to take it away, then the world would still be the same and we would still go about our lives just fine. Well, then why is it so popular? And how is art something that is so useless? How is it possibly so relevant to our lives, even though it's useless? It doesn't do anything. You know, it's been said, if you ask an entrepreneur what makes someone buy, or what their deal is, what their company does, it's the basic formula is, what problem does it solve? Well, if art is so expensive and people are buying it and it's useless, what problem does it solve? Is there a problem? We'll get into that on this episode of The Fen Den with your host, Sean Allen Fenn. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter and other social media at Sean Allen Fenn. And my contest for today is, all you have to do to win $100 is go ahead and wait till the end of this episode and I'll tell you what to do. Okay, so listen towards the end and I'll tell you what you have to do to win $100. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. Okay, let's get right into it. What is going on if art is useless? I mean, presuming that art is useless, that's an interesting question, isn't it? Because if you ask any number of people, what is art to begin with, it's one of those things that has many answers, doesn't it? I mean, go ahead and ask somebody, hey, what is art? And you'll hear so many different answers. Like, oh, art is a painting, or art is just a creative object. Art is, some people confuse art with design. What's the difference between art and design? Simple. Design is actually useful and is designed with usually, most of the time, a utilitarian purpose. Like, you design a website for the user to use, or you design a home. Architect designs a home for people to live in. A graphic designer will design typography to do some advertising for someone. So that seems useful, and that's what the difference is between design and art, where art is not made for the exact same purpose as something that is used, like a utensil or a urinal. The most famous example. This is definitely the most famous example, and I probably mentioned this on previous episodes of this podcast that you're listening to, that is titled The Fen Den. Hashtag The Fen Den. I mentioned this before. Marcel Duchamp famously submitted as an artwork into a art salon, as an art show of the time, where the whole premise of this art show was that any artist was welcome to submit art. Okay, so easy qualifier. It just has to be art, and we'll accept it. Okay, so Marcel Duchamp in around 1913 was already a famous artist. Well, fame is kind of relative, a relative term in the art world. In other words, artists knew of him. You could say he was an artist's artist, where his paintings at the time, like Nude Descending a Staircase, was displayed at the Armory, where it was a big art show that still happens today in a different form. But anyway, he had a painting called Nude Descending a Staircase that's similar to Cubism, but not exactly Cubism, of a person walking down the staircase, but like fragmented into these slices of snapshots of the person's movement. And this is back in a time where that had never been done before. It was related to Cubism, to where artists were starting to look at the world through many perspectives at once, applying paint to the canvas to demonstrate how the many sort of possibilities that exist can all be put into one picture. Well, the feedback was that painting was not well liked. Anyway, he was already known, though. He was very major player in the art scene. And Marcel Duchamp is one of my favorite artists because he was so intellectual. He was really good at chess. He actually quit art to play chess. I mean, that's the life, isn't it? So he would think steps ahead, and he would do that with art too. And so that's the coolest thing about art. And when you ask what is the use of art, it's not entirely useless, but it is sort of abstract and intellectual. And that's because it taps into the part of the brain that is at once it's the sort of primal for a human. I mean, if you have ever went and looked at pictures of ancient art, early prehistoric art, where in France there are paintings, and other places of the world too, but in particular there are these cave paintings in France that are prehistoric. So cavemen were painting on the walls, even at the very beginning of human life. The first artwork that is known to exist is a sculpture called the Venus of Willendorf that is prehistory, and that's a sculpture of it looks like a fertility goddess. So as human beings, we've been doing this for a long time. Why do we do it? if it's not necessary? Have you ever thought about that? I mean, we don't have to make art, but it looks like the evidence is showing that we can't help it in the same way that we make music. Okay, so what's going on if we don't have to do it? Why are we doing it? From an evolutionary standpoint, our reptilian brains, the primal brain, the first like primal section of our brain is concerned with keeping us alive. We need the bare essentials, the essential things: food, sex, maybe that's all. Self-preservation. So that's why we do what we do. In everyday situations, we are still often functioning on this primal level of this fight or flight reaction to anything that is unexpected, to the point where on a subconscious level, the reason why people might give you resistance, or why you might feel rejected by people in interactions with them, is simply their unconscious mind is reacting and essentially questioning in one split second, can I mate with this? Is it food? If not, I'm not going to take the energy to deal with this right now. Is it going to kill me? Do I have to run from it? Okay, so why is art a signifier of wealth and well-being? Well, think about it. It means that a person is at a level above fight or flight, where they have surplus, to where this person can make music, and this person can make art, and this person can have art displayed. And those cavemen probably were, I mean, this is totally conjecture because I wasn't there, were you? But probably they were doing okay in life. I mean, let's think about it. They had the cavemen who made the paintings on the walls in those caves probably had enough resources to where they could go out and make the pigments. And they weren't starving, because they weren't spending their energy on just surviving. They weren't even just striving. They had already made enough of, I don't know, whatever they had to do. They already had enough food and health to go out and get these pigments to make these paintings on the walls. And that is similar to how a peacock has these seemingly useless feathers. Okay, what do these feathers do? When you see a peacock feather, are they serving a purpose of, like, are they a claw to where they can protect the animal? Or are they teeth to where they can help the animal eat? Well, no, it's a feather. It's a colorful feather. What the hell is that for? Evolution? Well, it's because it shows the animal's mate, or potential mate, that this animal is healthy enough and strong enough to have these beautiful feathers. And so from an evolutionary standpoint, that gives an advantage to this animal to procreate. And so I'm influenced a lot in life, I noticed, by when I took this anthropology class in community college, and there's the professor, his name is Chuck Cargill. I don't know how I remember this. It would be awesome if Chuck Cargill was listening. Can you imagine? And yeah, dude, if you're listening, hit me up. Okay. Anyway, this is an anthropology course, and he was this guy who was like a throwback from the 70s, and he had a medallion and like a shirt unbuttoned low and chest hair, and he would just talk about like survival of the fittest, and how people mate, and how from an evolutionary standpoint, the important thing, like the number one thing that we do, why we do what we do, is to procreate, so that our DNA is passed on. So what does this have to do with art? What does this have to do with the value of art? I know what you're thinking. Sean is going off again. Well, yeah, that's true. But I'm setting that up to kind of create the context for what the purpose of art is, okay? And on the one hand, it's actually just something that people do because we're a creative species, and so we just do what we do. Okay, but why? And now, if we're a creative species and we're just doing what we do, well, how does value come into it? So this episode, I'm going to cover what are the measurements of value. How do you measure how much artwork is worth? What's the merit of the benefit of owning art? Is it utility? Well, no, I kind of ruled that out. Is it the pleasure or satisfaction gained by having it? So if you're an art collector, is it that you get satisfaction from collecting art? Recently, I heard this really great quote that was given by John Assaraf, who is an entrepreneur, author, a self-made millionaire. And he says that price is an issue when value is a mystery. And there's lots of mystery with this. How the hell do you value art? And the reason why this is relevant right now is because if you are looking to buy something from an artist, and considering that most galleries don't publicly post prices, a lot of times it's not clear. It's very notoriously opaque. And so here's what you look for, okay? And this is coming from, and if you're an artist, this will help you to increase the value of your art and to make work that people want. So listen up. Number one, people don't value what they don't understand. So if no one values your art, they don't understand it. And so you need to clarify for people why they should be interested. How do you do that? Well, anytime we have to look at like economic things, like the market of something, we always consider the bottom line is supply and demand. If anyone can make art, and I believe that anyone can, regardless of your skill level, anyone can make art. Well, okay, cool. If that's true, though, then there's so much supply, and if the demand is not there, then guess what? You're not going to sell any art. That sounds simple enough, right? Okay. So then how do you create demand for it? And how is art in demand, and how can galleries demand high prices for this art? Something that is so subjective. When Charlie Munger, who is a partner of Warren Buffett, he never took an economics class. And he did study human behavior, though. And that is probably why this man is such a genius with money. But Charlie Munger gives an example of Coca-Cola. When Coca-Cola in the 80s came out with new Coke, they changed the flavor of Coke. And it was one of the most famous bombs. It was the most famous failures, for lack of a better word, in Coca-Cola's history. Because how can you improve on a flavor? It's so subjective. How can you quantify if a flavor is good or not? Well, let's see. One way, the flavor itself is unquantifiable because people have different taste buds. But what you can look at is the market for that flavor. So, what happened when Coca-Cola came out with new Coke? The sales plummeted. People hated it. Even though it wasn't bad, it was just new. And new is usually exciting. But you take away something that was already working, and people hate it. How do you do that? Why would you do that? I don't know. My point is, just like you cannot really quantify a flavor, you can quantify the market, okay? But the flavor is so subjective. Just like one person might like a certain work of art, and another person will hate it. So that indicates that the aesthetics of a thing doesn't really matter. It's not quantifiable. Whether something is pretty or ugly is subjective, and it's determined by the culture. That's why classic beauty, as we understand it, like when we look at a picture of like a supermodel, you have to wonder why we think that is pretty. Who told us it was pretty? Who told us she was pretty? And it comes from Plato's aesthetics. Our English word beautiful is loosely derived from the Greek word kalon. Not being Greek, it's all Greek to me. So correct me if I pronounced it wrong. But the whole idea, the notion of what is beautiful, comes from a small group of people stemming from the Greek ideal of ancient times, which is essentially touches on the symmetry of something. Something has to have a certain symmetrical relationship, and that is interesting when you consider that very, very few things are entirely symmetrical naturally that occur in nature. But when you look at the relationship of the distances between the eyes and the nose and the mouth, all of those relationships of distances, we get accustomed to wanting to see this sort of balance. Now, I'm saying this to explain the usefulness of art, where it seems outwardly that it's useless, but it's actually useful. And its main use is the continuation of our need as humans to make sense of the world. How do we make sense of things? Life imitates art. Art imitates life. The Greeks also kind of articulated on this when Plato talked about mimesis, this kind of imitation or representation or emulation of our visual or world and our reality that we live in. So art is serving the purpose of making sense of the world by making representations and imitating life. And it's up to the artist to determine how that artist wants to go about doing that and how that work resonates with people. And so this is all not really quantifiable in terms of valuing how much something goes for on the market, right? But in the same way that we want to see symmetry, that we've grown accustomed to believing that a supermodel is pretty because she's symmetrical. Her proportions tend to be symmetrical in their relationships to each other. And for our society, that has been bestowed upon us by the Greeks. And it doesn't take away the fact that we have this familiarity bias. Okay? To where we respond to what is familiar. Now let me explain how that creates demand. 3 artists that do this really well, famously, that you know of, that you have heard of, are Andy Warhol, Takashi Murakami, and Jeff Koons. They are successful. You know who else was great? All the great ones knew how to do this. Salvador Dali knew how to do this. Picasso. But this is, go ahead and argue with me, because Picasso made some crazy stuff, but the amount of frequency and they were so prolific in the way they did that it started to become really recognizable. So the work of these artists is very recognizable. Now, this is counter to there's so many variables. This is counter to the measure of scarcity, because it's scarcity that measures or that determines how much something is worth. But if an artist like Warhol and Koons and Murakami are so prolific, and then there's less scarcity for the work, then why is it still so expensive? And the factors that cause that are that the kind of work that they do is, like, for example, like pop art. Famous pop artists tapped into this familiarity bias, and they started to make art based off of consumer products that were familiar to us and would put them in a new context. And so therefore they created some novelty to it. And this is another way to create demand, is to tap into this novelty bias. People need novelty. They need status quo, and they need something novel. You need to surprise people.
Ooh. Ah. Oh my God. Oh my goodness. Wow. Oh, jeez. Oh man. Did you see that?
Example of the element of surprise at work. How many surrealists does it take to screw in a light bulb? A fish. Huh? Because you see, surrealism, it doesn't make any sense. It's absurd. And that's where Duchamp came from, was the Dada movement that was sort of predating the surrealist. And the absurdity of it all. They were anti-art. And the reason why that Duchamp artwork is so significant is because it was anti-art. So it was novel. and it was already made. So Duchamp didn't even make it. He had it made, and he signed it. And his point was, art is whatever the artist says it is. Whatever the artist determines to be art. And of course, that artist who does that has to have a certain amount of clout, you know. And that clout also will contribute to the value of the artwork. See where I'm going with this? Now, do you want to know more about my contest today? How you can win $100 from me? This is going to be a good one. This is fun. Okay, here's what you do. Post on Instagram your favorite surrealist or Dada or absurdist art. And hashtag the Fenden and tag 2 friends and me. Got it? You have to be following me on Instagram at Sean Allen Fenn. You're listening to The Fenden, where my goal is to win your hearts and change your minds. Okay, so the artist has to have clout. So that means that they have to be at a point in their career where they already have demand for their work. So that's a given. I mean, naturally, they have to be showing, they have to have some attention, and there has to be a record of sale of their work, okay? So in order to be a record, there should be a certificate of authenticity, which will allow me to explain more about how art is valued, why it's so expensive. Okay, it is widely determined by documentation, and auction records are a good, really strong record. And it doesn't have to go to auction to be valuable, although that certainly helps. Because auction houses such as Sotheby's and Christie's are an authoritative resource for information, how to value this stuff, okay? So number 1, authenticity. The authenticity of the artwork. These are things that determine art's value. Authenticity. Number 1, is it original? The originality of it? What's the verification? And we need to know it's genuine. How do you know these things? How can you tell if it's genuine? Especially if it's an up-and-coming artist who doesn't have a lot of art that has gone to auction already. But you're getting their art from a primary dealer. How can you make sure that you're getting a good price? Well, the fact that there is a certificate of authenticity will help to continue to preserve that value, to increase the value of that art. So make sure when you're buying art that it comes with a certificate of authenticity. Always getting it in writing will establish the value of something. Because over time, there needs to be a catalogue raisonné for the artwork. That's a descriptive catalog of works. And the more extensive, the better. It will explain the descriptions of every work from the artist, and it will have explanations and scholarly comments. If you can do this for your art, start documenting everything and get it in a book, okay? That is a really good way to establish the value and continue to build your career if you're an artist. Certificate of authenticity goes a long way. All right. Someone with expert knowledge or training, especially in the fine arts, should be responsible for coming up with this catalogue raisonné, and the connoisseurship is going to matter in establishing the value of this art. For a well-known artist, if he or she is a painter, the brush strokes are recognizable. As an up-and-coming art dealer, one of the privileges that I have is being allowed into the atelier of artists, their inner sanctum, and they get to go visit their studio. And I won't ever represent an artist unless I can visit their studio. That is something that any artist should be aware of who is just starting out. You want to have a place where you can have a studio to invite people in, and the benefit of doing that is you get to see firsthand what they do. When I first started my company artlingo.com, there was an artist who was one of our first artists. I think it was even before we used the name Artlingo, we used another name. And we were looking for artists, and by the way, I'm currently looking for artists, and you have to be a working artist, and you have to be someone who has a voice and someone who is serious about what you do and professional and keeping good records. Okay, so get that out of the way. But my story is worst case scenario. When we first started Artlingo, there was someone who we brought on who my business partner at the time showed me, and we saw this person's art on their website, and it looked really cool. Really, is actually really, really good in terms of like images that were kind of, good composition and interesting to look at and stuff. But there was something really shady that we couldn't pinpoint. I couldn't figure out, but there, your instinct is basically your gut feeling, and it's these unspoken things that are markers that trigger, something that will allow you to figure out that something's wrong. Anyway, that was going off. And so when we were about to launch the site, I Googled him one last time and found some crazy stuff that he was accused of, some sexual misconduct that I don't need to get into, but it involved underage girls, and it wasn't looking good for this dude. So needless to say, I couldn't be associated with him, and that is worst case scenario of not getting a studio visit. The flag before that happened, the flag was that I couldn't understand if he was selling originals or prints or copies. He was making his work on Photoshop, which is not wrong. I don't mind if something is made on Photoshop. That's actually kind of cool, but just make it your thing, own it. And he was not owning it. He was shady about it. And he was pretending these are originals when they were prints and they were done on Photoshop. And one more time, I stressed that there's nothing wrong with Photoshop art. Stuff that's done on a computer is totally cool. But it's just you can't be shady about it. You have to own it. So anyway, that's a worst case scenario. So there should always be a studio visit, and you always want to see in person how the artist does it. What's the process. See how they work. Look at the kind of paint that they use, and so you can get a strong sense and build a relationship with them. So that is very important. And you want to see their work because of the condition that if it has longevity. There is nothing wrong with unprimed canvas, but you have to be okay with it cracking. And while I know there's plenty of artists who don't like to prime their canvas and they'll just paint on raw canvas, and that can be popular, but the restoration fees for that stuff cracking, you have to be okay with. And so you have to look at the condition and the preservation of the work. So that's the second factor. So number one, authenticity, and number two, condition, and how well it's preserved. If it's in pristine condition, then that is usually the best indicator of its value. But even if it's cracking and it's not new, it doesn't have to be pristine to be valuable. But it depends on the picture. For example, Joan Mitchell is a painter who was known for very multi-layered work that it actually is going to crack. Like you expect it to have cracks in it. And it can still be valuable even though there's cracks in it, because it's Joan Mitchell, and she was very significant in that abstract expressionist color field era, like with Franz Klein and that scene. So there is the clout of the artist that supersedes the condition of it. Does that make sense? So there's some variables here, but that's why you have to allow the market to decide. Okay, so again, we're looking at supply and demand. Is there a demand for it, and is it rare? That's the third thing, rarity. How rare is the artwork? Scarcity increases value. And a side note, again, another side note, I'm going to go down this rabbit hole, but in our age of this new kind of digital economy where there actually is no scarcity, how does that play with, how does that affect the value of art? If art needs to be scarce to be valuable, but in a digital market, like, does it matter? Does it affect it? That is why it is not common to buy art online, to where you can buy almost anything online, and you can buy art online totally. Younger generations are more likely to buy art online. But I was talking to someone just yesterday who is from an older generation who could not imagine buying art online. You have to see it in person. However, with the emergence of Instagram, by the way, you can follow me at Sean Allen Fenn, and follow ArtLyngo too, ArtLyngo. And I'm interested to see how blockchain technology can be used with art in creating this ledger of authenticity. There's something there, and I'm interested in collaborating with people who are working on this, who are much smarter than me. I know, here you thought I was a genius, but dude, oh man, I have so much to learn. Anyway, what I do know, however, I'm going to stick to what I know. You with me? The artwork has to be, number one, rare, and it has to be desirable. So going back to how do you create that demand? You got to create the demand, dude. That is the key. I mentioned a couple ways to create demand. Number one is there has to be novelty, and you have to take into account familiarity. Social proof. Do other people like it? No one wants what no one wants. So there has to be some social proof, and there has to be trust. There has to be some credibility. So people have to, have the sense of being able to trust the seller and trust the artist. So that's why the artist has to make a lot of work. I have a friend who he's super talented. I love this guy. He's a writer. He's very prolific. And he also has started making paintings, and he asked me to help him, and I'm so glad to help him. It's just that I had to emphasize to him that you have to make 100. You can't stop at just 5. You can't make 5 and think you can have a show. Make 100. So you have to be prolific, but not too prolific, because there has to be some scarcity. In fact, sometimes I've heard of art dealers who limit the amount of art that comes out of their artist studio to create the scarcity. There's a lot of variables. So it depends on the artist and it depends on the market. The market has to be so strong for the work to be valuable. And another way to create demand is to have some mythology to it. And to have some mythology to something, now we're going to talk about the fourth factor, and this is probably one of the biggest deals. I mean, one of the biggest factors besides authenticity. I mean, they're all pretty important, but this is where the collector comes in. Okay, so listen up. If you want to be taken seriously as a legitimate art collector, then listen to what I'm going to say. You are part of the ecosystem, and you are part of the story of the artist. You as a collector are included in the biography of the art. You are in the story. To whom much is given, much will be required. Or as Spider-Man says, great wealth comes with great responsibility. Just kidding, it wasn't Spider-Man, it was Bill Gates. So that is your job, Mr. Collector, to be responsible. Okay? Not everyone is aware of this. Provenance is about the collector, not the artist. Now, I know this. A lot of people have a problem with this because it seems elitist, and people talk about art snobs, and in the art world, notoriously, there are definitely art snobs. Okay, and I'm not condoning being an art snob. In fact, I'm totally anti being art snob. Just remember that the buyer is just as responsible as the seller in the art world. So actually the buyer has to sell himself or herself to the seller. I know it's weird, but it's because of provenance. Because if an art dealer sells to someone who doesn't have the qualifications to keep up the work and to continue to increase the value of the art, the art dealer is not going to sell to that collector. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, it is what it is, but that is one of the core things about the art market. And that's what makes the art market different from other markets. Does that make sense? Now, it doesn't always have to be that way, and it is not 100% that way. But more often than not, that it can be expected. There is a responsibility of the owner to keep up the art. In the same way, BMW makes the buyer sign a contract to keep up the BMW with the proper paint job, and so they make the buyer responsible. for maintaining the value of the BMW. Speaking of cars, another example of provenance is association. Okay, this goes right into this Pavlovian association bias. For the same reason that Pepsi Cola wants to use celebrities in their commercials is because of this association bias and this Pavlovian need to be associated with something that is already in high esteem. When a Ferrari that was owned by the Pope went on the auction block, simply by the association that the Pope owned it, increased its value, and the thing sold for $6 million. And so it's vital to have, or if you want your art to increase in value, to have this unbroken provenance of significant people owning the art. Sometimes the artist will go out of his or her way to make sure that someone important owns the art. Okay, and that's also why an artist won't want someone else to own it, is because they don't have the same status. And again, I'm not going to judge it. It is what it is. That's how art is valued. Famously, Calder, who was known for these incredible colorful mobiles, these hanging sculptures that are they're balanced in a very fine-tuned, colorful way. Alexander Calder, in 1942, made sure that the founding director of the MoMA, Alfred Barr, made sure that he in fact insisted, for 25 years he wrote to this guy. Calder wrote to Alfred Barr to get his sculpture into the possession of this director of the MoMA, but there's a conflict of interest, so he couldn't accept the work until he was no longer working for the museum. But Calder went out of his way to get his work into the collection of this person. For 25 years he waited until Alfred Barr would finally accept it after retiring from the Museum of Modern Art. In conclusion, who owns the art, who has owned it, matters. Who is part of the story? The collector who owns the art is part of the story of its ownership that contributes to the value of the artwork. And so, for the primary art market, a painting that is, even if it's produced on Photoshop and printed out as an archival print, okay, not even an oil painting, but it's possible for an artist to just make an artwork on a computer, print it on an archival print on canvas, put it on really nice canvas, put it in a frame, get it in a gallery, and sell it for $20,000. And it will sell, and it is valid because of the provenance and the story of that artist and the context of the art community and the history. And it doesn't have to be an oil painting for it to be valuable. It can be anything is art, and just like a urinal can be art. Anything can be art. So it doesn't matter what it is, but what matters is who owns it. So the provenance matters, the condition of the work, the rarity, and the authenticity. So as I conclude this episode of The Fenden, so glad I can do this for you. I'm making time for you because I love you, and I am interested in hearing from you, and I want to give you $100. So to do that, Post your favorite Dada or Surrealist or Absurdist art on Instagram. Hashtag the Fenden. Tag me and 3. I said 2 earlier, but tag me and at least 2 other friends. If you tag 3 friends, you have a better chance of winning. And you have until, I'll give you a little bit longer this time. I'll give you until this Sunday night. Okay, this airs on Friday, and on Sunday it ends. How about that? I'll give you a little more time. So again, to win, you have till 11:59 on Sunday night, January 14th, 2018. I love you. Be great. Be amazing. Be like a scarecrow, outstanding in your field. Thanks for listening. I want to talk to you. Reach out to me. You make me look good.